So I had inherited a garden that was very low on weeds, and my role in that position was to maintain that. So if we got a new set, I needed to make sure it fit into the garden, so to speak. That was a huge blessing to come into a very well-maintained instrument tracking system, and then to maintain it for 3 years was my role.
Rising above the ultrasonic cleaners and the clanking of stainless steel are the ideas and voices that are changing an industry. You're listening to the Beyond Clean podcast, the central nexus for people, processes and products that are improving our sterile processing world. Each week we speak with frontline technicians, CEOs, engineers and entrepreneurs with a common goal to help you fight dirty, every instrument, every time. Whether you're tuning in for education or inspiration, we're glad you did. Now turn on those washers and turn up the volume. It's time to go Beyond Clean.
This week on Beyond Clean, we are speaking with Joseph Martin. He's an SPD educator at UC Health Memorial Central, and this whole season dedicated to tracking systems. And we're going to actually have this conversation about the lack of a tracking system. So a little bit of yin to the yang for this season to talk about Joseph's experience in having a really nice and robust tracking system, and then going to something that's manual, some lessons learned, some benefits of manual tracking, and finally some tips and tricks that our listeners can really put into place today either way.
Yeah, Justin, the stats are still kind of all over the map in terms of the percentage of folks that have manual versus electronic tracking methods. We hear anywhere from 50% up to maybe 60, 70% of folks out there having electronic tracking. So that leaves still a large portion that are in this manual world, but it's still tracking, and we still got to find a way to get it done correctly and safely for the patients at the end of those instruments. So I'm pumped to hear from Joseph today.
All right, coming right up, Joseph Martin, SPD educator at UC Health Memorial Central. We're just going to take a quick break. I'm Justin Poulin.
And I'm Hank Balch.
From the 17 studios, you're listening to Beyond Clean, the global voice of sterile processing.
Joining us now is Joseph Martin, SPD educator at UC Health Memorial Central. And Joseph, you're a first-time guest on the show, so I want to welcome you, and we're very excited to talk to you today about flip it and reverse it is the way that Hank positioned this one, going the opposite direction with tracking, electronic to manual. So all you ever hear about is automation and electronic and going the other way. So again, flipping the script. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
So, Joseph, why don't we start? Why don't you talk a little bit about your role, maybe how you know Hank and another team member, Bobby, who's done a great job since joining the team not quite a year ago. And if you've got any awesome dirt on Hank, I'd love to hear it.
Oh, man. He enjoys cowboy boots and lifts them up pretty high during interviews, and he is proud of them. He's proud of his boots. I know Bobby and Hank from Louisville, Kentucky. I started my SPD career with them in the University of Louisville and Kentucky One Health Network. So I started SPD, got my feet wet, and they were there in the interview.
Great. And tell us a little bit more about your role today, being an educator, and what that's like in your day to day. I know a lot of departments out there have lost educator positions, so I just love it when I hear there are still educators out there working and bringing this value to the department, especially with, we know how much turnover and how many new entrants to SPD, are required to sustain normal staffing levels right now.
Yeah, my role as the educator is trying to make sure people know what they need to know and documenting that along the way so that I can show anybody who comes into our department, so-and-so has been trained on this or that matter. So I need to know that people know things. So as an educator, I work on creating competencies, implementing competencies, trying to keep track of who needs which competencies, and making sure people are competent at their jobs. That's my basic function in the department.
I really love how you said, I need to know that people know things. I've never heard it positioned that way, but it is really important. And it has everything to do with quality in the department, right? If everybody knows what they're doing and you're able to help educate them and move them along, then the OR or the internal customer is going to, have a good experience. And so as we bring you on to talk about tracking systems, I'm going to extend this, give us a little bit of your background a little bit further and talk about why you're an expert to talk about instrument data and tracking systems, et cetera. What are your experiences with these systems, maybe implementation and functionality where you've worked now and previously?
So my role and background with tracking systems is from a user point of view. I don't know all the details on the back end of data management and SQL and things like that. It's more of I'm an SPD technician and I need to make sure that count sheets are accurate. So one of my first early roles in SPD was a data specialist. So I built count sheets. I standardized the format for how instruments were written and shown in the tracking system. The order of how you talk about an instrument was all over the place. So sometimes you'd have a 7-inch curved cryo clamp, and then other times you'd have a cryo curved clamp, and then, it would just be all over the place for how an instrument was talked about. So I worked on trying to clean up the data and what a technician saw when they scanned a set and building out count sheets. Some sets didn't have count sheets where I was at. So I worked on that as well.
And then, Joseph, after that role, you went into a different role that still was heavily based on instrument data. Can you talk about that one real quick before we jump into the meat of this interview?
Yeah. So after I was a data specialist, I moved into an instrument coordinator position, and I had the joy of being an instrument coordinator with a tracking system that was extremely clean and well built and well organized. So I had inherited a garden that was very low on weeds, and my role in that position was to maintain that. So if we got a new set, I needed to make sure it fit into the garden, so to speak. And yeah, that was a huge blessing to come into a very well-maintained instrument tracking system, and then to maintain it for 3 years was my role.
I've never heard instrument data compared to garden before, but as a new gardener myself, that really hits home because I guess I had started prior to the pandemic, but the pandemic was really the first time I was like, okay, I'm really going to do this because I'm home way more often than I've ever been. And I'm going to give this little gardening thing a shot. And man, the pests were crazy. Like the weeds I could deal with. The pests were unbelievably destructive. Like you come out and where did all these caterpillars come from? And like all my broccoli is gone overnight, Yeah. And I would imagine do you want to add some more meat on that metaphor of I understand what a weed is maybe, but what are some of those complicating, headaches, even walking into a well-maintained garden, as you described it, what are those other data pests that you encountered or had to overcome in that role?
The first one that I can think of is when we would get a new product or a new set. I wanted it to look similar to everything else as much as I possibly could. I didn't want distractions to the technician when they scan that set and they pull up the count sheet. I wanted them to focus more on actually inspecting the instrument and assembling the set rather than trying to decipher any sort of strange distraction, so to speak. So the standard format for count sheets was what I tried to fit everything into. So getting new products was probably a pretty important role that I thought I could be helpful and maintain this tracking system by making everything fit. Pictures was also pretty big. We would get new instruments sometimes, and I would need to take pictures. The people that came before me already had a photo booth. We had a camera for the department and a little data chip that I could snap a picture, throw it into the computer, clean it up, and 3 minutes later, I could have a clean-looking picture of whatever it was that the technician needed to find and assemble into their set. That was one thing that I really wanted to make sure was there, because when the technician is encountering something new, they might have been told about it in a shift huddle. Hey, we're getting a new, whatever it is, a new set, and they haven't necessarily seen it yet. So when they scan it a week later on another shift, everything is there for them to properly assemble it. They can identify everything that needs to be identified. So that was just maintaining the system. Things like making it better would be, we get all kinds of little tiny knickknacks on instruments. We'd want to disassemble it. I found it important to take pictures of the small knickknacks and separate them on the count sheet so that a technician could easily find this teeny tiny nut on an instrument that needed to be assembled or disassembled for that matter.
That is such a great tool, because how many people, as you say, don't necessarily know that instrument. And if it does require disassembly, I love the picture of it fully disassembled, because you could be violating the IFU and not even know it. And I've heard countless stories of technicians being like, oh, I didn't know that part came off. And so building that actually into the count sheet is sort of an assembled and disassembled contrast to validate that they had followed the IFU, because obviously they're not going to be able to pull up the IFU for every single instrument that comes through the department. And you would hope that they would if they saw a new one, but it kind of depends on how the day's going and what the workload looks like, right? In a lot of cases, I'm not saying it's acceptable, but I'm saying it's the reality. And so one of the things I wanted to ask you, and you kind of alluded to it, you were talking about maintaining the set, but there's a couple of things in building and maintaining count sheets. And who did you involve, like outside of maybe even your own department, as you look to make changes or standardize? I know you said it was pretty clean when you came in this particular scenario, but who do you recommend working with to ensure that the count sheet that you put together delivers the product that they actually want in the OR?
The OR is probably one of the main customers. The OR staff would be who you'd want to involve at some point, because sometimes when you are assembling a set, the order of the count sheet can dictate and direct the technician to put it in a certain way that makes it easier or facilitates for the OR to pull it out and get what they need and find what they need. It's just important to involve the customer in certain circumstances. It's not every case. Some sets are pretty straightforward that you get, but every once in a while, you want to involve the OR, because they're the ones that are going to be opening it, and a count sheet can direct a technician to assemble the set in a certain way that helps them.
It's an interesting, throw in another metaphor. Let's use fast food. It's not the case that, like at Burger King, the customer is always right kind of thing. Although I don't think Burger King really believes that anymore. But in terms of count sheets, the customer, the end user in the operating room, they have critically valuable information to share. To your point, that's completely true. But because they're not on the assembly side and on the packaging side, there are some things that ultimately, and I think this is what you're getting at, the sterile processing technician actually knows better on the best way to outline this on a count sheet, or at least the best way to describe it in a way that the end user is going to get what they want, but they may not know how to describe it in a way that actually gets them that end product. So that's where that database specialist, instrument coordinator, sterile processing educator comes in and says, okay, if you want it this way, then we have to say it this way, or we have to outline it this way. And, some of that disconnect obviously comes in to, is the operating room using the count sheet to actually do their counts? Because if they are, that order of the instrument is going to be very, very important for them. If they're not using that count sheet for any of that, then it doesn't really matter, and we can really customize and create it in a way that makes the most sense in terms of assembly. But we need to get to the topic of this interview, which is manual tracking in comparison to electronic tracking. So let's go into this role, because so far we've been talking about your experiences as a database specialist, as an instrument coordinator in the context of a tracking program or electronic tracking, and then you took a new role. So I'm curious, when you were interviewing for that new role, obviously, since I wasn't interviewing you, there wasn't a pair of cowboy boots that was, propped up on the desk or anything. But besides that, did the topic of a tracking system even come up? And if it did or if it didn't, how did you feel when you first realized, oh, I'm going someplace that does not have a tracking system? Kind of what were those thoughts that went through your mind?
It did come up in the interview. I was one of the questions that I asked. I had a lot of questions because I was moving to a new state, a new system across the country. So I had no concept for what the hospital and the department was like. So I did ask about whether or not they had a tracking system. And when I found out that the organization that I would be moving to didn't have a tracking system at that hospital, I was pretty amazed because it's a level 1 trauma hospital. How are they able to track their instruments to the patients? How are they able to find what they need to find without it? I had no concept of doing SPD without it. It was what I grew up with. It'd be like, it was just, I had no concept for a department like that. And it was one of the first things I told my wife when I got done with the interview. This hospital doesn't have a tracking system. I can't believe they don't have a tracking system.
Yeah, and your wife's like, yeah. So what does that matter?
What does that mean? Yeah.
Yeah, I was pretty amazed.
It seems like I was trying to think through that analogy, because you're describing that. And the first thing that comes to mind is like trying to get someplace new without a GPS. So someone said, hey, like, come visit me in my house in this city across the state, a couple states, and like, here's the address, but you can't use GPS. So now you're like, I know people used to do this and they used to do it pretty successful. It was possible for people to show up places and get there on time without the internet. But yeah, that is just a whole nother world in our generation, especially. So that shock wore off. Obviously, you ended up taking the role, or getting offered the role, and accepting the role, and then you show up. So talk about some of these insights, because I know a lot of folks are going to be curious. There's tons of folks that have gone the other way, from manual to electronic, but I think this is a pretty rare, situation to go from electronic back to a manual, at least with all that experience and focus that you had, because this is your job. Like, your job was the tracking system. Now you're getting thrown into something that is just not there. Like, the whole rug's pulled out. So what are those things that you feel like you took for granted, or that you didn't even realize was difficult, or maybe even easier without a tracking system? Kind of talk us through those.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing I probably took for granted was the productivity. And depending on how a hospital, tracks their productivity or whatever metric they're using for the productivity for SPD, when you have a tracking system, it can be a whole lot easier for showing how much product you're producing, what your department's doing. But when you don't have a tracking system, it's all manual. So rather than clicking a report to show what so-and-so processed on their shift, it's one person manually entering on an Excel sheet what so-and-so sterilized. So thankfully, I don't have to do the productivity. There was a period of time where I was doing the productivity for our department, and it would take me 45 minutes for every day to catalog and document what our department did. Like I said, I'm thankful that I don't have to do that anymore. Our supervisor does that, and she's faster than me, and she can do a whole day's worth of productivity in half an hour. But it still takes her half an hour to catalog and document everything that our department sterilized for the day.
What about those things that are harder to fix? Like, I feel like in an electronic tracking system, especially in a well-maintained garden scenario, if there is a weed, you just go in, you pluck it out, and you go on with your day. And the change can be a global change. It can be a tray. It can be communicated and, emailed directly to the operating room. Like, all those kinds of things seem to work very smoothly in electronic type scenario if it is well maintained. Like, what are some examples of those things where in the manual sense you're like, okay, I got this problem, there's this missing instrument, there's this update, What's that process like?
Probably the biggest thing or the quickest thing that I can think of as far as being hard to fix with an instrument inventory without a tracking system would be the standardization of instruments. Hospitals don't just pop up overnight, and once they do pop up, they exist for a long time. And instruments are purchased from different manufacturers over the years, and after 10, 20, 30 years, there's going to be a lot of different instruments that have come in and gone through the hospital. And a lot of times people want to try and standardize to a particular manufacturer for a particular kind of instrument. We could do that and purchase it, but the ability to show it on the count sheets means you have to go into every single count sheet and change the catalog number one by one by one. That's a big undertaking, and hospitals that don't have tracking systems just don't do that. So over time, you get some sort of smorgasbord of catalog instruments, and you just really can't feasibly change to one manufacturer on paper very quickly.
So, Joseph, let's bring this into the context of education, because we kind of started back there. You're currently an educator now, and even with all the productivity side of things and all the data quality side of things, if you're looking at the cleanliness and the correctness of a database, that is not the exact same as educating new technicians or educating existing technicians on things related that kind of have a crossover to instrument data, even if the data is being tracked manual. So what does that change and impact of kind of that electronic versus manual process in your job as an educator?
Probably all my competencies are done on paper. So when we have our competencies and I put them in the hands of a preceptor, or if I'm doing them, going from top to bottom on this paper sheet to make sure that I can check off and sign that so-and-so knows this particular bit of information about our department. It's all on paper, and when we get done with the competency and we sign our names at the bottom, that goes into a file cabinet. I can't really digitize that quite easily. I can scan it, but it's all tracked on paper. So training someone in a department is all done on paper for us. I think probably when we bring in someone completely fresh, no SPD experience, I do notice, even still without a tracking system, people rely heavily on the catalog numbers to identify instruments, which is why they're there. But when you're fresh in SPD, you rely extremely heavily on the catalog numbers to know what goes into a set. Because we have no pictures of our instruments, they really have the catalog number and an instrument description and themselves and, well, the people around them, which is how people learn. They learn the instruments pretty quickly. Because we have no pictures to aid them, they have to force their brains to visually remember what instruments look like. So
just kind of throw them in the deep end.
And how big is your staff?
We have around 25, 30 people in our department.
There's a John Wayne clip. I don't even know what movie it's from, but like this little boy comes up to him and he's like, "You can't swim?" He's like, "No, I can't swim." So John Wayne like grabs him by the end of the shirt, and the pants like throws him into this little creek that they're standing by, and then he learns to swim. I don't recommend that model of training for, swimming at least, but I wanted to ask you that kind of Google effect. Like we've heard this, I think, for a couple of years now, that things like Google has made us stupider or dumber because we don't have to remember things. We don't have to learn things. We just Google it. And it seems like from what you're saying is you see the impact of that lack of ease to information having a positive training impact, I guess, on how quickly or how thoroughly your technicians learn instrument. Is that a correct assessment?
Yes, I would say definitely. I mean, we have shift huddle on a regular basis, and at some of our shift huddles, I'm able to print out a picture, pull it off the internet of an instrument that's in our department, and I will hold it up, show the picture to everybody, and ask who can identify this instrument. And within about 5-10 seconds, depending on how tricky I'm trying to make the instrument, they're gonna know it by name. And just the other day, we had a technician that recalled by name a heparin flushing needle, and she started in August, and it's February now. So already by now, she's able to visually identify a heparin flushing needle, and we're a level 1 trauma facility, and we process all kinds of different instruments. So people learn their instruments really quickly.
So that really leads well into my next question, or really our last question. I bet you can't believe how quickly the time flies on these interviews, but you're kind of describing an upside. And the upside is that in the manual tracking, we don't have a crutch. So actually our knowledge base may be a lot stronger, and by requirement has to be developed much more quickly to be able to thrive in the role, right? So I'm hearing that. I'm not sure you're positioning that necessarily as an upside, but I'm hearing it as an upside. Are there any other upsides or positives to manual tracking that you can think of?
I remember really disdaining scanning all the time with a tracking system. You're scanning. You feel like sometimes you're scanning more than you're processing instruments. That's not always the case, but that's kind of what you feel. So moving to not having a tracking system, I get the joy of not scanning things. A cart comes down in decontam, I pull it off the dumbwaiter, and I start cleaning instruments. I don't have to worry, did I scan this set to decontam? We can take sets to the OR, and the OR can unload them, put them where they need to go, and no one has to worry, did the instrument get scanned to sterile storage? Because we don't have a tracking system. So the joys of not scanning has been kind of nice, but obviously I wish we could scan things.
So it's more flexible in a way, but it doesn't necessarily give you as much information to look for process improvements. Would you summarize it that way?
Yes. I mean, the ability to locate sets quickly is crucial, and not having a tracking system makes that intensely hard. Having no digital breadcrumbs to find where a particular set is in our hospital is challenging. So even though I love not having to scan things to places, I wish we could, so we could easily and more quickly find things.
So I'm going to wrap this up and just kind of say, like, now you know what it's like to live without a tracking system. If you were to go to a new facility and implement a tracking system, or go to a new facility that has one, but you want to utilize it better, what are some things about experiencing manual tracking that you could bring to the table when you had a tracking system again in the future?
Well, we are getting a tracking system, and we're supposed to get one in this coming calendar year with a go-live date of this summer.
Great.
So we are in the midst of collecting data and preparing to get one. So the first thing I know, moving away from a tracking system, working at a hospital that has none, and then getting one, is that I'm going to be intensely thankful for the tools that we do have. It's taken a long time to get a tracking system, and sometimes facilities and technicians have to wait even longer than what I had to wait. So I'm incredibly thankful that we're getting one. And knowing how much work we have to do to make it a high functioning tracking system and all the training that we have to do, I just think it's motivation to really work hard to make the tracking system do what you need it to do.
Well, I'll tell you, you got your work cut out for you as an educator, Joseph.
Yeah.
It sounds like you've got a busy year or two ahead, and I want to wish you luck with that project and congratulations.
Thanks.
And I can tell that you're going to be a huge resource to the rest of the team there as you go through that. And I love the tip of disassembling and taking pictures of disassembled and assembled instruments to just help with that reprocessing speed, efficiency, and accuracy. So you did an awesome job on this interview. Congratulations on your first appearance.
Thanks.
On Beyond Clean. You killed it.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it, and it's been a lot of fun.
That was Joseph Martin, SPD Educator at UC Health Memorial Central, and we're talking about manual tracking, but specifically, Hank, his experience going from a well-established electronic tracking system to something that's manual and more spreadsheet, paper-driven. I love that one of the benefits of manual is just the knowledge base, which I think is a huge thing. It's almost like you want to have the electronic to get somebody off the ground, but you almost want manual to get a new SPD tech really understanding the instruments. I don't know if there's a good way to marry the need with the enhancement and get kind of the best of both worlds out there, and probably has everything to do with the kinds of trainings that Joseph, has put into place as an SPD educator. And finally, I'm just taking the pictures and putting it in the tracking system. I know that's not on the topic of manual, but what a great tip for all the folks out there that have a tracking system today. And that is a problem. Just always making sure that instruments are fully disassembled. What a great way to help just embed that into your existing processes and prevent that from becoming an issue.
Yeah, Justin, there's a lot of great cheap options on Amazon for like light booths to take photos of small things like surgical instruments. I think they're like, $20-$30, but they're just like a little white square. You bring in your department and then boom, it turns into like a little photo studio. And yeah, all of that is such great information for technicians to see it as they're processing or if they have any questions around it. And I think the big takeaway for me on that, was that kind of Google challenge of having so much information accessible, but not truly soaking it up in a way that you have to if you're in that manual context. I think one of the solutions, because you asked this, or one of the scenarios that we see this happening is if you do your sterile processing training in a school format, like a live school training, typically they're not training you on a tracking system. So you're learning these instruments in the manual way, through your training program. You come out and you really do know those instruments because you have no other option. Like you need to learn them to pass the class and then to get into that department. So, that process is there, but you're right. We may need to approach that in a different way, even for departments that have the capability to do electronic tracking, to separate the training from, hey, this is how you know your instruments. This is how you use the tracking system. And let's keep those two things separate.
All right. Well, great episode from Joseph. Loved the interview, but that's going to do it for this week's show. As a reminder, you can support Beyond Clean, but you got to find us on Apple, Amazon, or Google Podcasts and subscribe to us. You can also find us on Stitcher, iHeartRadio, or Spotify. And if you've already got a favorite podcast application and it's not one of those, just search for Beyond Clean Podcast and pull us up. We've also got bonus content, and this is the best way to get Beyond Clean podcasts and information. Download our smartphone app for iPhone and Android. It's got all of the episodes historical. It's got them categorized, whether it's articles on the go or the Beyond Clean podcast or even the vendor spotlights that we put out. And many of them do include bonus content. You just click on that gift box right there in the app. While you're there downloading the app, we'd love a rating and a review because your feedback is important to the show. And if you have any topics that you'd like us to cover in the future, just send an email to info@beyondclean.net. On behalf of Hank and myself, thank you for listening to this week's episode of Beyond Clean.